Greetings, true believers, and welcome to another blood-curdling episode of History of the Marvel Universe. For this week's tale, let us begin at the beginning, at the dawn of life on Earth. In those early days, billions of years ago, the energy produced from the planet's burgeoning biosphere crackled with raw potential. So much so that from this energy itself, a consciousness emerged, the being known as the Demiurge. This new sentience seeded the Earth, creating its first ethereal life forms, a race of powerful creatures which would collectively be known as the Elder Gods. Reigning unchecked for millions of years, many of these ancient gods were corrupted by their own power and grew dark and demonic. One such being was the great shadow Chthon, who would one day be known as the god of chaos. During the reign of the Elder Gods, Chthon devoted himself to learning to control the mystic forces, and thus became the world's first master of black magic. However, his sister Gaia took on a different role, appointing herself the guardian of the tiny nascent organisms developing in the Earth's oceans. Seeking to protect organic life from her demonic siblings, Gaia conspired with the Demiurge to birth a protector. Thus was born Atum, the first of a new breed of god with the power of the sun. With his blazing strength, Atum slaughtered the demonic hordes, ridding the Earth of the evil Elder Gods. As he did, he absorbed their dark energies, transforming Atum into Demogorge, the God Eater. However, Chthon was clever and had etched a record of his mystic knowledge onto sheets of indestructible parchment. Before he could be destroyed, Chthon escaped to another dimension, leaving his scrolls behind, forever providing him with a link to the Earth. With his work seemingly done, Atum cast aside the demonic energy he'd absorbed from the Elder Gods and took to the sky, becoming one with the sun itself. It was that evil energy that eventually spawned Mephisto and other devils who would become Hell Lords, each often using the name and visage of Satan. After that, the eons passed by and Gaia watched as new life naturally evolved over millions of years, albeit with some interference from celestial beings, eventually resulting in the emergence of modern humans. Evidently, at some unspecified point in the ancient past, Chthon's scrolls were used to empower the siblings Morofla and Uathacht. While they became beings that survived by feeding on human blood, they were not true vampires as we know them today. Eventually, mankind founded the most powerful civilization in the prehistoric world, the nation of Atlantis. It's been written that this was accomplished with the help of Agamotto, the very first Sorcerer Supreme. He was the son of another surviving elder god, Ashtur, who left the Earth tens of thousands of years before the God Eater destroyed her demonic siblings. It's also been written that around the year 19,000 BC, new conflicts arose among the four remaining elder gods, Chthon, Ashtur, Set, and Gaia. Agamotto summoned representatives of the Elder Gods to Atlantis to attempt to broker a solution in a summit that was attended by the most powerful sorcerers of the era, the assemblage of avatars. Among the followers of Chthon present was an Atlantean necromancer named Varney. While some sources claim that Varney was human, others imply that he was actually a Gigantopithecus, a species of ape that was nearly extinct. He and the other avatars of Chthon were led by a skull-faced member of an elder race which preceded humanity, Thulsa Doom. While little was accomplished by the meeting itself, Agamotto did take notice of a representative of Gaia named Zhered-Na. He would later aid her in a battle against the Dweller in Darkness, so you can watch that video for more details about that. 500 years after the assemblage of avatars, Thulsa Doom and his followers made enemies of the Atlantean-born king of Valusia, Kull the Conqueror. In his war against wizardry, Kull eventually succeeded in doing what time could not by killing Thulsa Doom. Desiring revenge, Doom's followers succeeded in locating Chthon's scrolls and plotted to transform members of their order into supernatural creatures with the Chaos God's magic. Varney, having been mortally wounded by King Kull, volunteered to be the first but died as the incantations were being performed. He was buried in a stone coffin filled with blood, but 3 days later, Varney arose anew, having been transformed into a new kind of undead horror, the first vampire. The sorcerers repeated this process with several others to create even more, including Verdale, Lamia, Marison, Saracen, Boy, and Nosferatu. These original vampires would later become known as the Ancient. In some legends, a being known as Lilith, the mother of demons, is said to have given birth to the first vampires. While her involvement in these events is unconfirmed, she did live in Atlantis at the time and thus may have aided in the creation of Varney, and could even conceivably be the literal mother to some of the ancients. However, when the wizards attempted to command Varney as if he were a mindless beast, the undead monster attacked them. Those slain by vampires rose again as vampires themselves, subservient to Varney, who became their lord, and reveled in their worship for centuries. However, another 500 years later, in 18,000 BC, the Earth was shaken by the event known as the Great Cataclysm. I already talked about what caused the Great Cataclysm in detail in both my video about Namor, the Submariner, and the one on the origin and history of the Eternals, so you can watch either one of those for more information. The important thing for today's story is that the catastrophic damage was so widespread that the entire continent of Atlantis sank to the bottom of the ocean. During this upheaval, Varney hid and preserved himself by slumbering within his sarcophagus after filling it with a bloody soup of human viscera. While he slumbered, he had visions of the outside world and occasionally awakened, at one point establishing an island headquarters in the Greek Isles. After the sinking of Atlantis, some surviving humanoids adapted to their undersea environment, becoming the race of water breathers we now know as Atlanteans. According to legend, alien beings also created another form of unholy life from something called Shiggoth tissue. This new kind of monster, known as the Aqueous, soon spawned their own vampire sect by infecting Atlanteans and other underwater races. For example, some members of an eyeless race called the Faceless Ones were also transformed into Aqueous vampires. Meanwhile, Morofla and Uathoct, the siblings who were previously empowered by the Chthon scrolls, magically created a race of humanoid bats called the Afterlings. In the Hyborian Age, around 10,000 BC, Varney awakened again and mentally seized control of the Afterlings. He also sensed that a group of mercenaries had obtained one of the Chthon scrolls, which potentially contained a spell capable of annihilating his kind. He plotted to steal back the scroll and use the mercenaries in a massive blood sacrifice to transform the Afterlings into true vampires. But this scheme was foiled by an adventurer named Zula and his companions Conan the Barbarian and Red Sonja. However, Varney escaped and vampires spread across the world, developing into various subspecies over the millennia. For example, the Nosferatu are long-fanged vampires that resemble the Ancient of the same name. The Trix, otherwise known as the Vithra, are a matriarchal race who live underground and feed on other vampires. Yiki-Onna are vampires who typically reside in Asia and can transform their bodies into clouds of razor-sharp ice. Charnaputra are large winged vampires native to the Himalayas. The Adzi are a hardy clan who could survive being staked in the heart for up to 10 minutes. And Huskies, while not true vampires, are partially transformed humans who have devolved into feral creatures and haunt people or places with significance to their former life. However, some creatures which have been described as vampiric, such as Jiangshi, Chupacabra, and Rakshasa, have no known connection to Varnian vampires. There are many other vampire clans and sects as well, most of which are largely composed of the more common humanoid vampires. Of course, the unifying quality that defines all vampire types is their need to subsist on fresh blood. They exist in a near constant state of bloodlust, typically requiring at least 1 quart of human blood every other night. Most will feed on living humans, with their choice of victim often reflecting their sexual preference. The most common method of obtaining blood is through the jugular vein, located in the neck, which the vampire will pierce with their elongated fangs. Typically, this also causes an enzyme from the vampire's saliva to be deposited in the victim's bloodstream, which then produces a green liquid called ichor within a deceased person's arteries. If this happens, the victim will themselves rise as an undead vampire, usually within 3 days of being bitten. However, other unknown factors can affect this process, as some victims will transform almost immediately, even from a non-fatal bite, while others may not change at all. The effects of vampirism, if any, on victims who are already supernatural or superhuman in some way can also be unpredictable. Often victims who do not die exhibit partial symptoms of vampirism. In these cases, the victims are normally subject to hypnotic commands from the vampire who bit them. However, they will usually revert to normal if said vampire is killed. The supernatural nature of the vampire affords them many abilities, such as superhuman strength and enhanced healing, although most cannot regrow severed limbs. However, injuries sustained from silver weapons take much longer to heal, and puncturing a vampire's heart with either silver or wood is typically fatal. Furthermore, most vampires cannot survive being beheaded. Vampires usually remain ageless, retaining their physical appearance from when they were first bitten, as long as they regularly ingest fresh blood. Most do not cast reflections, have the ability to mesmerize humans with eye contact, and can often transform into bats or bat-like creatures. Less commonly, some vampires can change into other forms, such as wolves or even mist, while others can exert control over the weather to generate winds and thunderstorms. However, vampires are not without weaknesses and can usually be repelled by garlic or religious iconography, provided the wielder has sufficient faith in said iconography. In some cases, a vampire will be unable to cross running water or enter a home uninvited, but these are less reliable. The vampire's biggest weakness is sunlight, direct exposure of which will prove fatal to almost any vampire unless specifically protected against it. Vampires are often weakened during daylight hours and will hibernate in their coffins until nightfall. In rare cases, a vampire can resist the sun while standing on native soil, or even more rarely by transforming into a human during the day and resuming their vampiric form at night. But back to the story. The original vampire, Varney, emerged again around the year 2000 BC. Wishing to increase his strength, he forced a Sumerian sorceress named Amshed to create a ritual of ascendance to give him the power of a god. Amshed complied, but ensured that the ritual could only be performed once every 1,000 years, and needed to be done in the recipient's homeland, which for Varney no longer existed, as he was born in pre-cataclysmic Atlantis. 1,000 years later, he attempted to raise Atlantis through a series of complex spells, but such a feat proved to be too much for even the Lord of Vampires. 1,000 years after that, shortly after the birth of Christ, Varney stole a crystal skull that was meant to be a gift for the newborn Messiah. This time he was defeated by a time-traveling Native American spirit who tricked Varney into flying so high that his body froze, causing the vampire lord to shatter upon hitting the ground. However, Varney is harder to kill than most vampires, and after 33 years his body reformed. Meanwhile, the Chthon scrolls were passed down among humanity throughout the centuries. Sometime around the year 500 AD, most of the scrolls were obtained by the half-fairy sorceress Morgan Le Fay, who succeeded in binding the parchments together into a single tome known as the Darkhold. Because of this, those who used the scrolls, dating all the way back to the servants of Thulsa Doom, were subsequently referred to as Darkholders. Morgan Le Fay and her Darkholders attempted to use the book to summon Chthon himself as their servant. However, realizing the Elder God could not be controlled and unable to banish the essence of him that they had already summoned, the Darkholders sealed a piece of Chthon's soul beneath Mount Wundagore. Fearful of the book's power, Morgan Le Fay's beloved Magnus stole the Darkhold and placed it inside an enchanted tower that nobody with evil intent could enter. However, this did not prevent the well-meaning Modred the Mystic from finding the Chthonic tome. While he sought the book for noble purposes, Modred lost his soul regardless, sacrificing himself so that Chthon would not claim his beloved Janus. Sensing the Darkhold's dangerous power, the wizard Merlin contacted the Catholic Church for help. In response, they sent one of their most powerful mystic knights, a man named Brendan, later known as Saint Brendan, who used his power to scatter the Darkhold's pages across the Christian world. As for Modred, because he was tainted by the Darkhold, he was sealed away in suspended animation by his master Gervais. Varney continued to be active during this time, earning aliases such as Sathagua and Croatoan. At some point he was also mistaken for the Mesopotamian god Baal by the Babylonians, who indeed existed as a separate entity. Around the year 1000 AD, Varney attacked a Viking settlement in North America, leading to a battle with the Norse god of thunder, Thor Odinson. While the two were evenly matched, Thor was able to open a portal to the sun, letting loose a burst of light that forced Varney to flee and destroyed all but one of the vampirized Vikings. Several decades later, in 1149, the pages of the Darkhold were reassembled by a Satan-worshipping monk named Aelfric. Because of his sacrilege, the mad monk was burned at the stake, although the Darkhold scrolls could not be destroyed. Over the following year, the scrolls changed hands several more times until they were obtained by the Catholic Church. This time, a young monk named Paolo Montesi was strong-willed enough to read the cursed text without being corrupted by it. In an attempt to stop the Darkhold's curse from spreading further, the Pope commanded that the pages be collected into a single volume once more, henceforth known to the Church as the Book of Sins. He also decreed that Montesi be allowed to marry and sire offspring, and that his family would be the book's custodians forevermore. If you watched my video on the history of Carnage, his descendant, Victoria Montesi, is briefly involved with those events. However, Varney learned of Paolo Montesi, and in 1190 AD he led his supernatural army in an assault on the Vatican. While many vampires were slain in the attack, Varney himself predated Christianity, and so the Church's crucifixes had little effect on him. The vampire lord killed Paolo, unaware that Montesi's son, Giacomo, was born that very night. Granted an extended lifespan by the Darkhold, Giacomo Montesi scoured the book for the fabled spell that could destroy all vampires, only to conclude that the scroll containing it must have been lost during the Hyborian Age. He eventually tracked the missing scroll to a hidden city of mystics in the Tibetan mountains, Carnage. However, in 1350, before he could obtain the scroll, Giacomo Montesi was assassinated by one of Varney's human agents. But then in the early 1400s, his son, Marcello Montesi, continued his work and contacted the wise men of Carnage. Taking a different tactic to keep the scroll out of Montesi's hands, Varney approached an ambitious young man from Carnage named Callue. Callue was already a talented practitioner of the mystic arts, and so with added instruction from Varney, he was able to conquer the city of Carnage and severed ties with the Montesi family. However, Callue was then challenged by his former classmate Yao, who despised violence but wished to stop his fallen friend. The details of their rivalry are perhaps best left for another day, but Callue ultimately fled, unintentionally trapping himself in the realm of Ragador. As for Yao, in subsequent centuries he would become known as the Ancient One, and obtain the title of Sorcerer Supreme that was once held by Agamotto himself. After Kalu's defeat, Varney grew weary of his unending unlife and decided to begin searching for a successor. And it was in that century, in the year 1430, that a boy named Vlad Dracula was born in Transylvania, the son of the ruler of Wallachia. In 1444, he accompanied his father and brother on a mission to Turkey to negotiate peace. However, upon crossing the border, the trio were attacked and abducted by the Sultan's forces. The two boys were held captive while their father, Vlad the Elder, was instructed to enact policies that benefited Turkey and returned home. For 5 years, the boys were tortured and Dracula's brother Radu perished from his injuries. Meanwhile, Vlad the Elder earned the ire of his trusted advisors due to his loyalty to the Turks. And so Vlad the Elder and his remaining son, Mircea, were killed by his former allies, led by a man named John Hunyadi. At age 18, the younger Vlad escaped Turkey and returned home. Fearing his father's killers, he soon fled to Moldavia, but returned in 1451, begging for mercy from Hunyadi, who then trained him in the art of war. After this, Dracula followed through with a prearranged marriage and was wed to a Hungarian noblewoman named Zofia. However, it was a loveless and abusive marriage. His heart dark and twisted, Vlad would openly assault the servant women, and any who denied him were put to death. After the birth of their daughter Lilith, Vlad stripped his wife of her royal standing and banished her with the infant. After that, Sophia left the baby Lilith with an elderly woman named Gretchen and took her own life. Meanwhile, after taking his place as the voivode of Wallachia, Vlad had the men responsible for his father's death killed, the method of which earned him the moniker of Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler. He also married his true love, a woman named Maria, and the two had a son named Vlad Tepulus. His infamy only grew after that as he slew the Teutonic knight Frank von Frankenstein and ordered a mass assault on Turkey. Meanwhile, Kamartaj had reopened communication with the Catholic Church and turned over the missing Darkhold pages, which were then added to the Book of Sins with the vampire destruction spell, becoming known as the Montesi formula. Then, in the year 1459, Varney took notice of Vlad Tepes. The vampire lord sent the Impaler deceptive visions, guiding him towards defeat against the Turks. Despite this, in the ensuing battle, Vlad actually succeeded in driving back the first wave of Turkish forces. However, he was then defeated by a group called the Riders of the Dark, who were led by the immortal mutant known as Apocalypse. Wanting to keep the Impaler alive in the hopes of using him to take control of Transylvania, the Turkish warlord Turak took him to a Romani healer named Leanda. However, Leanda was actually a vampire servant of Varney, and that night she turned Vlad the Impaler. At the same time, Varney himself confronted and killed Marcello Montesi before the Montesi formula could be translated. After returning to reclaim his prisoner, Turak seemingly killed the vampire woman. However, Leanda survived and transformed into a wolf to report back to her master. While Vlad was held captive by the Turks, his wife Maria was assaulted and killed by Turak and his men. After seeing his wife's death, the Impaler broke free with his new vampiric strength and took swift vengeance. After killing the men who held him prisoner, Vlad accepted his new nature and gave up his only son. Not only that, but he discarded his previous names, forevermore being known only as Dracula. Seeking to give Dracula a final test, Varney had another of his servants, Nimrod, consume some of his blood, turning him into a vampire lord as well. Dracula was then brought before Nimrod, who claimed to be the true king of the vampires. The Transylvanian challenged Nimrod for that title, and won. That same night, Varney confronted Dracula himself, turning his title over to him. For the rest of the night, Varney forced his successor to drink his blood, more than his fill, so that all the powers of the Lord of the Vampires would be bestowed upon him. The following morning, after 20,000 years of existence, Varney walked out into the morning sun and died. After this, Dracula sought revenge on any who had wronged him, including the Romani woman who had turned him into a vampire. Striking out against other Roma, one of Dracula's victims was a boy named Arnie, the son of Gretchen, who was the woman that Dracula's first wife, Zofia, had entrusted their daughter Lilith to. Wishing to avenge her son, Gretchen then used a magic spell to transform Lilith into a creature resembling a vampire, but without many of the weaknesses, making her immune to sunlight. In subsequent years, Lilith, the daughter of Dracula, would fight against her father and foil his schemes. The Vampire Lord then established his rule over Transylvania and Wallachia, operating out of Castle Dracula. From there, his influence spread across Europe and he claimed several vampire brides. He also took his revenge on the Sultan who had imprisoned him as a boy. It was around this time that Dracula was challenged by a rival vampire, a corrupted Catholic priest named Borgia. Dracula killed Borgia and, from his possessions, learned of the Darkhold and the Montesi formula. Unable to set foot in the Vatican himself, Dracula blackmailed a human thief into stealing the Book of Sins. However, the thief was intercepted by a sorcerer named Cagliostro who took the Darkhold for himself. While Dracula's enemies and exploits are too numerous to explore all of them in detail, it was in 1465 that he killed the beloved of Rach van Helsing, thus beginning a centuries-long feud between the Lord of the Vampires and the Van Helsing family. And indeed, it was the Van Helsings who helped local villagers safeguard their homes and improve their resistance against the vampire threat. At some point his own son, Vlad Tepulus, battled him and thus was killed by his own father. In the 1500s, Dracula and vampires in general also made enemies of the Puritan adventurer Solomon Kane. As Europeans colonized America, the last remaining Viking settler who had been vampirized by Varney 500 years prior was still alive. In 1591, the vampire Viking and her followers converted over 100 colonists on the island of Roanoke. The only clue left behind as to their fate was the word Croatoan, a Native American name for Varney inscribed onto a tree. In the 1600s, as vampires spread across colonial America, they were combated by hunters like Jonas Cray. In the late 1700s, Dracula battled Cagliostro, the mage who had stolen the Darkhold, but by then the book had changed hands again and its whereabouts were unknown, even to the Montessi family. In the 1800s, a woman named Elizabeth Van Helsing was killed by Dracula's vampire coven. While she rose as a vampire 3 days later, she was then destroyed by her husband, Abraham Van Helsing, who was himself the descendant of Rach Van Helsing. This experience, of course, spurred on Abraham's obsession with destroying Dracula and his undead ilk. Again, the details of Dracula's exploits are perhaps best left for another day, but notably in 1890 the Lord of the Vampires battled Abraham Van Helsing and another man, Jonathan Harker, while attempting to secure a foothold in London. While Dracula was thought to have been destroyed at the end of that struggle, he actually escaped by turning into mist. However, he left behind a diary which detailed these events. This journal came into the possession of the Irish author Bram Stoker, inspiring his 1897 novel Dracula. Through subsequent encounters with Van Helsing, Apocalypse, and even the infamous Frankenstein monster, it became clear that Dracula was far harder to kill than any normal vampire. He's certainly not invulnerable, as the typical methods such as staking and beheading will indeed stop him, but in Dracula's case, as soon as the stake is removed, or his head and body are reunited, he will rise again. In 1899, the Vampire Lord claimed victory against his nemesis and killed Abraham Van Helsing. In the early 1900s, Englishman John Falsworth was vampirized by Dracula and allied himself with Germany during both World Wars as the villainous Baron Blood. In 1929, a vampire named Deacon Frost posed as a doctor to feed on a pregnant woman, Tara Cross. The mother died, but her son, Eric Brooks, was born with a natural immunity to the vampire's curse. As a Dhampir, a being touched by the vampire's curse but not converted, Brooks was trained by a veteran vampire hunter named Jamal Afari. Brooks would later have to kill his master himself when Afari was converted by Dracula. Throughout the 1940s, costumed heroes were becoming more common, and several of them battled vampires at various times. In 1945, Quincy Harker, the son of Jonathan Harker who had encountered Dracula in 1890, became an expert vampire slayer himself, but lost the use of his legs in a battle with Dracula. In Hungary in 1952, a Romanian scientist named Karl Gottfried created a vampire monster of his own. However, Gottfried was killed by an angry mob who didn't realize that his monster was designed to only feed on other vampires. In more recent decades, the former surgeon, Stephen Strange, studied under Yao, by then known as the Ancient One, and became a powerful mage. Early in his career, Strange attempted to revive his deceased brother Victor, whose body had been preserved in cryogenic suspension, with a spell from the Book of the Vishanti. However, in his inexperience, he unknowingly read from a chapter called the Vampiric Verses. Victor Strange was partially transformed into a vampire, and thinking he'd failed, Stephen kept him frozen. There have also been examples of individuals who have been transformed into vampiric creatures by science rather than magic, the most famous of which being Dr. Michael Morbius. However, these so-called living vampires are not supernatural and thus are not considered true vampires. Meanwhile, unable to fight himself, Quincy Harker supported and allied himself with various other vampire hunters, including Frank Drake, who is in fact a descendant of Dracula himself, Rachel Van Helsing, the great-granddaughter of Abraham Van Helsing, Taj Nital, a tracker from India who lost both his son and his ability to speak in an encounter with Dracula, Hannibal King, a private eye who had been vampirized by Deacon Frost but maintained control over his bloodlust and personality, and of course, Eric Brooks, who by that point was known as Blade the Vampire Hunter. Meanwhile, Dracula had two vampiric sons in the modern age, Janus and Zarus. Janus is yet another long story best left for another time. Eventually, Quincy Harker confronted Dracula in his own castle. Sacrificing himself, Harker stabbed Dracula with a silver spoke while his wheelchair exploded, decimating Castle Dracula. As indicated in his will, Harker's skull was eventually recovered and converted into a magical item which prevented vampires from entering Britain uninvited. Dracula eventually returned and encountered the X-Men, during which time he tried and failed to convert one of their most powerful members, Storm. Unfortunately, he did succeed in vampirizing Rachel Van Helsing. After Dracula was defeated by the X-Men again, Van Helsing asked the mutant Wolverine to stake her. The X-Man did so, and Rachel Van Helsing died while watching one final sunrise. Shortly after that, Doctor Strange, Hannibal King, Frank Drake, and Blade joined forces and obtained the Darkhold. With it, Strange recited the Montesi formula, at long last casting the spell which eradicated all vampires from the face of the earth. Only two were spared. One was Hannibal King, since Strange was able to restore his humanity. The other was Victor Strange, because he was transformed by the vampiric verses from the Book of the Vishanti, which served as a counterpoint to the Darkhold's Montesi formula. After awakening, Victor was manipulated by the voodoo priestess Marie Laveau and became the new Baron Blood, stealing the Darkhold for her. With the Book of Sins at her command, Laveau resurrected the first vampire lord, Varney, further weakening the Montessi formula. Naturally, after his return, Varney battled the likes of Blade and Hannibal King. He even turned their former ally Taj Nital into a vampire, proving that the Montessi formula had indeed been undone by his resurrection. Furthermore, after banishing the vampire verses from the Book of the Vishanti, Dr. Strange discovered that the Montessi formula had also disappeared from the Darkhold, preventing the spell from ever being used again. Hannibal King even began displaying symptoms of vampirism once again. And of course, with vampires beginning to roam the earth once again, it was only a matter of time before Dracula was resurrected as well. Furthermore, sometime after this, Blade's vampiric father, Lucas Cross, conspired with Dracula to fulfill a prophecy to return essence lost from the undead in graves, which Cross believed would restore his soul. However, Lucas Cross had misinterpreted the prophecy, which instead restored every slain vampire to undeath. While one might assume that many simply died again from being reborn during daylight hours, the Earth's vampire population skyrocketed to unprecedented numbers. And while one might also assume that Varney is still the true Lord of the Vampires, in recent years he seems to be content to lay low and allow Dracula to rule in his stead. And rule he did, maintaining control over the various vampire factions and clans. That is until, well, if you want to read what happens next, might I recommend the 2010 one-shot, The Death of Dracula, which leads into the X-Men event, Curse of the Mutants. And if you want even more after that, there's a more recent Avengers story arc, War of the Vampires. But unfortunately, that's all the time I've got for this video, and there are plenty of characters involved that we could look at more in the future, not least of which is Dracula himself and the events recounted in Bram Stoker's novel. So be sure to let me know if that's something you would like to see in the future. In the meantime, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what Marvel hero or villain you want to hear about next, and as always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. Also, if you want to know more about some of the topics we touched on here, but I've talked about in more detail elsewhere, there are going to be some more video links in the description and in the pinned comment. But thank you everybody once again so much for watching, and until next time, true believers, Excelsior!